Welcome back, scholars of British literature. Is modern. This is Masterpieces of British Literature 1, English 3327, and I'm Mr. Dr. Long. And this is video 14, part 2, and I call this video the Neoclassical Order and Confidence. Neoclassical Order and Confidence. And in the first video, I brought us up to the point where I was discussing the eight-sphere cosmos that Dante presents in the Divine Comedy, and its connection to the eight spheres, eight notes on a musical octave, the music of the spheres. And Dante takes this idea of this concentric universe, this Ptolemaic cosmos that has Earth at the center and spheres moving outward, and after that last sphere, the eighth sphere is the sphere of fixed stars, and beyond the sphere of fixed stars is heaven, which is referred to as Imperium, right? So Dante has 9 levels above the earth. And of course, medieval people hated asymmetry. Everything had to be balanced in this symmetrical order. So if heaven has 8 spheres, then hell, which they believe was below the earth, must also have 9 levels of hell. The very bottom of hell will be sort of like what corresponds to the Imperium, or the outer edge of the universe, right? So what I want to do in this video is begin with this preference for symmetry in the Renaissance and neoclassical model, and show how it connects to some of the literature that we're reading. Okay, in the handout that I'm asking you to open up and look at and follow along while you're watching this video. If you haven't done that, I would encourage you to stop the video and open up that document, the attached document to the video, so that you can follow along, because I'm going to be referring to some imagery here. If we look at these models of Dante's 9-level hell, we have the 9-level hell, and it even has the different kinds of sinners that are in each level of hell. And what I've done is placed the model of Dante's heaven, the 9-sphere heaven. We see it moving outward from the earth in these outward spheres up to the Imperium. And what I've done is drawn arrows from the corresponding parts of each of those levels. So each sphere of heaven must have, according to this medieval Renaissance rule of symmetry, an inverse sphere counterpart representing the virtue in heaven corresponding in purity to the level of corruption in its counterpart in hell for that level of sinfulness, right? However, there's something interesting about the medieval frame of mind and that carried over into the Renaissance, and that is that medieval thinkers loved keeping things tidy, and they loved triads. They loved groups of 3. If you have 2 concepts or 2 phenomena in a medieval system, you have to have a third one as a mediary between the other 2. Okay, so it doesn't come as a surprise to me that this notion of a 3-part Trinitarian Christian God, even though it's a monotheistic religion, comes and is developed in the medieval period by medieval theologians, as Trinitarian God. If we have God the Father, and we have God the Son in Christ, that we saw in Milton's poem Paradise Lost, then medieval theologians posited or theorized that there must be a mediation a mediating term between God the Father and God the Son. And so what we have is this third term, the Holy Spirit. And I drew this sort of three-part model. The Holy Spirit is sort of the mediation point between God the Father and Christ the Son. Therefore, Dante and these other Catholic thinkers felt that this mediating term was required for mediation between heaven and hell, right? Which they called purgatory. This becomes very important in Luther's protest against the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church used purgatory, this place that they imagined was where sinners purge their sins before they can rise to heaven. It's the gate for people that people must pass through in order to get into heaven. Okay? Well, according to the Catholic Church, just like there are gatekeepers and ticket takers before you get into an event, the power is being able to charge a fee to get out of purgatory, right? And so that's what the Catholic Church was doing. They were charging money to people in the form of penance so that they would be able to be released from purgatory faster and get into hell. They weren't selling tickets into heaven, as might be popularly believed. They were selling indulgences, so that if people committed sins, they were paying for less time in purgatory. So I have a similar sort of triangle model in the sheet where heaven and hell are presented next to each other, and purgatory is presented as this mediating term between the two there. Again, what we have is this symmetry model. There has to be a symmetry. Right? The medieval thinkers loved the beauty and the order and the tidiness of Ptolemy's Russian doll model of the universe that consisted of these seated concentric spheres within one another. That's where we get the notion, again, of the music of the spheres. But there was a step two. Renaissance thinkers inherited this love of symmetry and order from the medieval thinkers, but they couldn't make that imaginary concentric sphere model of the universe fit the patterns that the stars and the planets actually made when observed. If you observe them closely, they did weird things, and it didn't make sense. They didn't act as if they were moving in perfect circles around the Earth. So there was a great deal of crisis there, and astronomers and scientists had to figure out how to reconcile the strangeness of the observed behavior with the model. So an astronomer named Johannes Kepler blew up that Earth-centered model, that Ptolemaic model of the universe, putting the sun at the center of the solar system and making the Earth and the other planets revolve around the sun in orbits that were shaped like an ellipse rather than a circle. An ellipse goes like this, not like that in a regular circle. Johannes Kepler freed the universe from that stationary center. The Earth is the stationary center. And he also freed humans from any claim to a privileged and stable point of reference in the universe. We were no longer the center of the universe from which everything was on display for us. We were moving around in the universe just like every other object. We were no longer in a privileged, stable point of view. When Isaac Newton he developed a system in Principia Mathematica that showed that all of Kepler's models of motion apply to any object, any objects in motion, and that they all obey these consistent mathematical laws, right? Newton gave back to all these thinkers another beautiful symmetrical order to those thinkers that they loved to have. They had it taken away from them, and what Newton did, I believe, is give them back that beautiful symmetrical order. And I just wanted to show you what I'm talking about. Even Newton's laws of motion, his 3 laws of motion, as he articulated them then, had a built-in symmetry. And what I've done is create this model where I have one part of Newton's law and a line down the middle to indicate a symmetrical fulcrum or center, and then the balanced part on the other side. So Newton's first law of motion, every body continues in its state of rest or of uniform motion in a right line, balance point, unless it is compelled to change that state by forces impressed upon it. Right? His second law, it's even more blatant. The change of motion, any change of motion, is proportional to balanced right side, the motive force impressed. The change of motion must be equivalent to, symmetrical with, the motive force impressed. Law number 3 of motion, to every action, this is probably more familiar, to every action there is always opposed an equal reaction. Everything is symmetrical. And Newton reintroduces this idea and shows that it's even more consistent with almost any object in the universe in a state of motion. It can be predicted in a very symmetrical, beautiful, symmetrical, mathematical way. So Newton's physics and music theory required what was thought to be a necessary application of symmetry. All objects in Newton's universe, like perfectly pitched music, were thought to realize perfect symmetries. And once you recognize symmetry in classical and neoclassical design, you'll begin seeing it everywhere. And for example, one example is the U.S. Capitol building. What I've done is juxtapose a front view of the U.S. Capitol building with the floor design of the U.S. Capitol building. And what you have is that same line running right down the center, and you have equal parts on each side, right? So the U.S. Capitol building isn't just a building. It is a symbolic metaphor for a balanced form of government. We have a bicameral form of government. On one side we have the Senate chamber, and on the other side we have the congressional chamber, and the strong implication is that the power of both those institutions is perfectly balanced between them. Neither side is stronger or heavier than the other, more important than the other. And of course, in the middle, you have the dome with that point. The implication is that it's sort of reaching up towards God, perhaps, right? But again, I have the idea of symmetry where the line is running right down the middle. Turn the page, same thing, right? The models of how musical notes of different octaves, the wavelengths are exactly half the size, right, of the same note an octave lower. Okay. What I want to do now is introduce this idea of symmetry to the 2 poets that I had you guys read, Alexander Pope and John Dryden. And what we have with Pope and Dryden are the introduction of the heroic couplet. And I wanted to show you that the heroic couplet, not only do you have a balance between, you have 2 lines that are balanced with each other each repeating the same vowel sound, rhyming vowel sound at the end of the line, but that's not going to work. It's not going to be equal unless there's an equal metrical number of metrical beats in each line. So if you look at the first 4 lines, we're going to look at the first 4 lines of Alexander Pope's Essay on Criticism, which are fairly famous. "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill." Okay. Notice I can read that line as sort of an upward inflection of my voice on one side. "'Tis hard to say if a greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill." Right? A balance between two different ideas, two ideas that are set next to each other, right? Lines 1 and 2, the 2 rhyming couplets are balanced against each other, but there's also a second level of symmetry between the first 2 lines. We can take those first 2 lines as a unit, as 2 rhyming lines, and then juxtapose them symmetrically against the 3rd and 4th line, which are also rhyming lines, so that he's balancing those 2 larger ideas together on as an equality of scale, right? "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill, but," the ironic turn, "but of the 2 less dangerous is the offense to tire our patience than mislead our sense." Right? There's a complete idea in those first 4 lines, and the complete idea consists of 2 symmetrical clauses. Okay? And the 2 symmetrical clauses are very easy to identify because they rhyme at the end. Ill, skill, ill, offense, sense, right? We can look at let's look at Dryden. All the beginning of his poem Mac Flecknoe. "All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey." The second line in the heroic couplet, which rhymes with the first, is a reinforcement of that first idea. It's a reinforcing example. All human things are subject to decay, major premise. When fate summons, monarchs must obey, minor premise. If the claim in the first line is true, then the claim in the second line must be true as well. Again, though, that the first 2 lines again form another grammatical unit that are symmetrically balanced against the same size grammatical unit in lines 3 and 4, just like in Pope. All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. This, what I just read, referring back to what I just read, this Flecknoe found, to who, like Augustus, young, was called to empire and governed long. Now, the heroic couplets, I think, are really important. Pope and Dryden are exercising and realizing this extreme preference for precise symmetry. Okay? Precise symmetry. We can see the effect of that neoclassical architecture, neoclassical symmetry infiltrating the culture powerfully. We go backwards about 120 years to Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, we have another example of symmetry in his poetic form, in his poetic meter and rhyme, and rhyme scheme. It's different, okay? So I want to look at, he uses what's called a Spenserian stanza. It's 8 lines. The rhyme scheme, 5 iambic feet, to-dum, 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 to-dum. And the rhyme scheme, instead of being heroic couplets where the last syllable of 2 consecutive lines rhymes, they go A, B, A, B, okay, for every 4 lines. And then the second set of 4 lines in the stanza goes B, C, B, C. So one of the rhyming sounds, the second and the fourth rhyming sound in the first 4 lines is repeated as the first and third rhyming line in the second 8, or the second 4 lines, right? But Spenser does something really interesting. He has 8 5-foot beats or 5-foot lines in his stanza, and then he ends with a 9th line that's 6 feet long. And this is what's referred to as an Alexandrian line. It has 6 feet. To-dum, 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 to-dum. And the sound that last Alexandrian line uses is a repetition of the last of the C rhyme line, the immediately previous line. Okay, so let me read that. A gentle knight was pricking on the plain, clad in mighty arms and silver shield, wherein old dints of deep wounds did remain, the cruel marks of many a bloody field. Let me read that one more time. A gentle knight was pricking on the plain, clad in mighty arms and silver shield, wherein old dents of deep wounds did remain, the cruel marks of many a bloody field. Right? First 4 lines. The second 4 lines take up the same rhyme from the last line of the first 4 lines. Yet arms till that time did never wield, his angry steed did chide his foaming bit, as much disdaining to the curb to yield, full jolly knight he seemed, and fair did sit. Right? First 4 lines, and the first 8 lines introduce an idea, but it's not the completion of an idea, and he uses the last Alexandrian line as a way to tie together, to knit together the symmetry of those first 8 lines. So it sort of summarizes and closes off the entire idea as one for knightly jousts and fierce encounters fit, right? And there's a period at the end. You might recall that reading John Milton's Paradise Lost and remember how long his sentences were in that poem. I remember reading him for the first time and wondering, I was continually distracted by the question, when is that period going to come at the end of the sentence? How long is this sentence going to go on? Not so with Spenser, Dryden, or Pope. They give you units of language that are predetermined. There is never, as far as I'm aware, there is not a stanza that Edmund Spenser writes in his entire Faerie Queene that doesn't end with a period at the end of one of his stanzas. It always ends in a period. Those sentences are always exactly the same size. Or the unit of meaning always ends with a complete idea at the end of the stanza. He never uses enjambment where he carries the sentence over to another stanza. Right? I'm going to consider the question of why those particular language forms and sounds, and those sound forms and ideas, those forms of sound and metrical pattern were being used to express those particular ideas in those poets and those poems that those poets were writing. For now, it's enough to consider how far the ordering of language had evolved between the Beowulf poet and this asymmetrical line built around repeated consonant sounds, and it was asymmetrical. You have the repetition of two consonant sounds, a caesura, and then the repetition of that consonant sound in the next part of the line. How far the system of sound and poetry had evolved since the Beowulf poet. Frumschäft, Fira, Fern, Reken, Quaith that se almictica, Earthen Werta, Ritbertna Wang, Swawater Babukath, Geset Sigretheg, Sunnen Munnen, Lomen to Lut, Landwundum on Gefrätweide, Folden, Schädels. Lärmend und Leifen, Lief, Ek, de Shop, Kina, Gewilkum, Fara, the Huis, Wierlath. It's come a long way. I was reflecting today that most poetry throughout human history was an awfully manly sort of activity. It was probably percussive, manly, and very martial. It inspired people to physical conflict. What we have in the neoclassical period, by contrast, is a very pretty, very beautiful, sort of lilting, consistently musical, almost meditative, like a song of poetry. Okay. I am going to continue. I'm gonna complete one more video, a 15th video, in which we take a closer look at the subject matter of the neoclassical poets, or the Augustan poets, and how the subject matter of the poems fit appropriately with the sound formation and the metrical formation of those poems. And that's, I think, a much more interesting subject to consider. Why does it work? Why does, for example, does a heroic couplet poem work so well for a mock epic, and probably would work terribly for a legitimate, sincere epic poem? Why does it work so well as a mock epic, something to make fun of an epic style or an epic subject? I will continue with that other video, and please stay tuned. I will announce when that video is available. And in the meantime, I hope you have a terrific evening and stay happy and healthy, and we'll see you again later. Thanks for watching.